morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this online event about hydrogen and the delegated acts. As you know, the delegated acts are pieces of legislation that were brought in by the European Commission a while back, and they were widely discussed. And for a while, we were waiting to see what was happening with them, how they were drafted. There was a lot of opposition as to, how to draft them, and a lot of conversations, if you like. And although in the first draft it was some of the main let's say lines that were following, they changed quite drastically once the final drafts came around, and even those final drafts were the ones that were approved. However, there is still some areas of that lack clarity. Even though we know exactly what the Delegated Acts say, we don't really know necessarily how to interpret them, how they are working in terms of the developers that are trying to put projects on the ground. So what we are doing today is we're going to analyze the delegated acts in a lot of detail. We're going to try and figure out exactly what's happening with them, how they apply to you as a developer, how they apply to you as a provider, and how you are going to be sort of part of that team that brings together these massive hydrogen projects that we need. So with us today, we have two experts that are going to be speaking to us about this issue, and I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves so that we can get to know them a little better. So Max, please, if you take your mute off and you introduce yourself, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Belen. Maximiliam Boemke is my name. I'm a lawyer and partner with Watson, Farley and Williams in the Hamburg office. Having now close to 20 years of experience in the regulatory sector, predominantly in the energy regulatory sector, and I'm also leading the Watson Farley Williams hydrogen campaign. And I am currently advising several clients throughout Europe and in the Middle East and Northern Africa on live hydrogen projects, which have one way or the other the purpose of importing hydrogen, green hydrogen that is, or its derivatives into the EU or producing it in the EU. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Max. And now, please, John, if you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, Belen. Hi, everyone. So my name is John Williams. I'm a director and the head of hydrogen within AFRY Management Consulting. I've been in consulting for around about 20 years now with my background in the natural gas industry, and a lot of the issues we were considering around the liberalisation of the gas market way back in the mid-90s are now coming back round again when we think about the development of hydrogen markets. I've been involved in quite a few projects now that have looked in detail at the delegated acts and what they mean for the commercial business cases of project developers. So hopefully can bring some of those insights into the debate today. And I'll say a little bit more about AFRY and what we've been doing on hydrogen when I present my slides.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Max. So I think we're all fortunate that we're going to learn from such distinguished experts in this topic, because it isn't easy. A lot of the things seem to be clear, appear clear when you read it, but then there's a lot of details and fine details that are really difficult to thread. So before we continue, we seem to have a lot of people today in YouTube. Seems there is a few problems maybe connecting via Zoom. So we're gonna, just so that you guys know, if you're in Zoom, you can send your questions anyway. Just put them in the chat, and we will be putting them inside here so that the speakers can actually respond to them. And we asked you please to send your questions, because this is a good way to keep the conversation going and make sure that we're getting to the right points and pressure points that you are having. But the way it's going to work is we're going to have two short presentations. Then we have some prepared questions that I think get to the point, where we think, most of the clarifications are needed. And the final is we have about 20 minutes plus, and this is European efficiency. So we are going to get that time to answer your questions. As I said, it seems we have a few issues, logging into Zoom today, but people are in YouTube too, and we can take the questions there. If you are in Zoom, please send your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen so that we can easily manage them. However, if you're in YouTube, just plug it into the chat bot and we will just make a note of it here, okay? So we're recording this session, and without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague Jesus to please take away this this slide so that we can begin the conversations per se. So Max, you're the first one up. So if you're going to put your screen on the whilst Max is preparing his screen, just to let you know, we will send you the recordings and also the PowerPoints. So you're going to have access to the materials, and the team is like working to try and figure out, what's going on with Zoom. Yeah. Go ahead, Max.
Thank you, Belen. Yeah, I have, as Belen said, indeed prepared just a few slides, and I won't bother you with the details of what is in the Delegated Act, what has been stipulated. This has all been around now for quite a long time, so there are several presentations which look at what's additionality, what's geographical correlation, what applies for early projects, and so on and so forth. So what I'm focusing now is today, what does it mean for projects actually, for live projects, and where are the issues with that, and where have the Delegated Act helped? Well, starting with that, I'd like to say as Belen said, we had very, very distinct discussions around whether the Delegated Acts are rightfully drafted, whether the content is in line with market expectations, whether the content is good or bad for the hydrogen industry, and so on and so forth. And that was a good debate to be had. Now, from a project perspective, with the entry into force of the Delegated Act, this discussion has now become academical. So the Delegated Acts are there, and they are what they are. And that is, in a way, a good thing, because we now know what the regulatory framework, at least on an EU level, is, and member states can start to transpose the Delegated Acts into national laws. Now, that is one thing which in our which in our consultancy, this is often overlooked by clients, and therefore that's kind of the first emphasis I want to put on. While the Delegated Acts provide the European framework, the Delegated Acts specifically say, for example, in relation to geographic correlations, that member states are allowed to set additional criteria, and that the Delegated Acts are to be transposed in one way or the other into national law. Now, for example, Germany is currently doing this by introducing certain amendments to the 37th Ordinance on the Federal Emission Control Act. But this is, if you have a live project, this is the first thing which you need to check. Where are your national laws which apply to your project in terms of the Delegated Act, and to ensure that the member state, to find out, frankly, whether the member state has introduced some additional criteria which your project needs to fulfill. Now, I've seen quite a lot of projects which have just overlooked this, and which just build up their whole project structure around the content of the Delegated Act. Now, that's not a bad way to start with, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly something which you still need to take into account is the applicability of national laws and national laws, the transposition of the Delegated Act into national laws. Now, Belen, you already said, well, still there is a debate on what is in the Delegated Act, what has been set, what is how is this applied? And something which is helpful is that the EU has provided a set of FAQ on both Delegated Acts, which address some of the questions and answers these questions which have been raised in relation to the Delegated Acts. I've provided the link here for you to check. Now, there's one particular point, because this has come up in our practice quite often in the FAQ, which has caused raised eyebrows. And that is a specific question on whether it's possible to conclude your power purchase agreement for the power you need to operate the electrolyzer via an intermediary. So the question was, can I buy, for example, from a green power from a utility contract, from a utility company who has in turn concluded a power purchase agreement with the operator of a wind farm? Now, the word intermediary, which the Delegated Act uses, is not entirely clear. However, markets have understood it thus far that it would be possible to draft the PPAs in such a way that it's perfectly fine to get the power supply from an intermediary, and there is no need for a direct PPA between the operator of the wind farm and the operator of an electrolyzer. Now, within the FAQ, the EU says this is not the case. The intermediary may act, and I say may only act, as some form of broker, of bringing together the operator of the wind farm and the operator of the electrolyzer plant, but it's not possible to have these contractual chains. Whether or not this is true is certainly not for the European Commission to decide, because that's a question of EU law, which is ultimately be decided by the European Court of Justice. However, these FAQ, as in other areas of law as well, if the EU provides FAQs, certainly has a huge impact on the practice. So therefore, particularly the procurement of power needs to be thoroughly looked at, and that's only one example I've just given you now to show what is under discussion, and that is certainly, if you're a project developer, you're certainly in no immediate need, I'd like to say, in immediate need to start your project by using a power procurement which is not in line with the legal view of the European Commission. For member states, this can also become problematic. And again, I'd like to point to Germany, because in the German version of the Delegated Act and the draft of the national legislation, the word is not intermediary, which they have used, but real trader. So there is a question whether national laws have already gotten up to speed with this rather new development on the view of the European Commission. And since power procurement is quite an important point, this is why I'm highlighting this here. Now, as said, if and how the EU rules are applied is still to a certain extent unclear, but this is not an unclarity of law, but rather on the application of it. So in a nutshell, there are still areas which need to be looked at, and certainly which need and require some further digging. But the fact that the Delegated Acts are there, and the fact that content on the application is provided, and is in particular provided by the European Commission, is certainly helpful. Now, looking at some questions and things we see in our practice, I'd like to briefly touch upon 4 points which we have heard. And as I already said, the EU projects have greatly benefited from the Delegated Acts. As I said, you can discuss over content and whether the content which we have now is correct, and whether another content would have been better. And certainly that's a good discussion around that to be had. However, the fact that a regulatory framework is set makes projects manageable. And now projects can apply these delegated acts, and the discussion can be more meaningful, in particular with banks, in particular with sponsors, on how the regulatory framework can be filled with life within a live project. And speaking from where I sit, we see projects going live, and we have just advised on one of the first green hydrogen projects. It was a project for sustainable aviation fuel in Europe, where the delegated acts and the content of the delegated acts have been enormously helpful in saying, okay, this is the direction in which the project is going. One point which, however, looking now outside the EU, is that the EU has used a bit of a blunt force method, which is certainly understandable, but provides some issues for projects which are located outside the EU, but which aim at importing their hydrogen into the EU. Now, as you will know, all the relevant hydrogen strategies discuss that the EU will, and assume that the EU will, for the time being, be an importer of green hydrogen, and will require third, i.e. non-EU countries to import their hydrogen into the EU. For obvious reasons, that is the availability of renewable energies, water, and place. Lots of the countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa are currently thinking of around how they can benefit from the market which is opening up for hydrogen being imported into the EU. As I said in my introduction, we are currently also advising in some of these areas, and Watson Farley has an office in Dubai, which where we're advising live projects in that area. And one point which came up again and again, the delegated acts state quite bluntly, if you wish to import your hydrogen into the EU, then you need to comply with the requirements of the delegated acts, full stop. However, this is something which is quite clear, but raises questions, and quite distinct questions, because as one project developer from Morocco said me, well, that's fine and good, and I've understood this, but what does it mean I need to have the same bidding zone, and the wind farm needs to be located in the same bidding zone as the electrolyzer, and how is this applied in countries where we only have one bidding zone, or where we don't know the concept of bidding zones? And that's just one example. Or where the grid is working legally, that the regulatory framework applicable to the grid is different from the regulatory framework within the EU, and where the concepts which are considered in the delegated don't really work. Now, the EU has said, well, we will have at some point in time a certified certification body, an accredited certification body, which then applies a certification scheme for these non-EU projects. That means your hydrogen gets a certificate, something like a certificate of origin, and you get a stamp, and it says this is RFNBO compliant under EU law. Now, that concept is fine and good. The issue is it's not there yet. One of the one of the concepts which, in my view, have the most prospect of being there at one time is Certify EU. And they have made good progress, but they are still quite far away from being this certification scheme and being the accredited certifier, which can help projects. Now, that keeps all the projects which are non-EU projects a bit in a state of uncertainty, and this state of uncertainty is not good if we, as an EU, wish to import hydrogen. Now, therefore, one of the main open challenges remains this certification scheme, and certainly the set of rules which then apply, which would need to answer the question, how in a given country are the requirements set by the delegated acts to be interpreted and then to be applied on a project. Until this is clear, all these non-EU projects face uncertainty, which will delay these projects quite significantly, in my view. One other issue, and that's kind of the final point I'd like to make today, is the discussion around the delegated acts from a project development perspective has shifted the focus, well, a little bit in the wrong direction. If we see projects right now from a legal perspective, we see lots of projects who's given lots of thought on the fulfillment of the delegated acts. They have quite well thought of power purchase strategies, and they know which their wind or solar farm will be, and all of the front side of the project is well thought of. However, where projects fail and where I see them to fail is on the offtake side. Now, you will not be able to successfully implement a project if your offtake remains open or unsolved. And therefore, one key giveaway and one highlight which I want to do today is that offtake is key for a successful project. And I can't emphasize this enough. A project which is based around some non-binding LOI on the hydrogen is on very unstable feet. So therefore, as one project developer said to me once, in hydrogen, you have to think the project backwards. So you have to start with the offtake and then start developing your projects based on the offtake and the requirements of your offtaker. And then eventually we'll get to the delegated acts. But all this discussion around the delegated acts, as I said, have shifted the focus a bit in the wrong direction. So therefore, if one piece of advice I'd like to give you today is start thinking about the other side, the offtake of the hydrogen or the hydrogen derivatives, which you will want to produce as well. Well, that's it for my side. I'm hoping for a lively discussion, and I'm very keen to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think something that we do badly all the time is that we don't think about the offtake enough, early enough, and importantly enough. You know, we were talking about all of these targets that we have from in terms of getting importing and exporting hydrogen, and we're not really thinking who's going to take that hydrogen, which I think is where it starts. So thank you very much for all your thoughts. If you can stop sharing now, and
Yes.
We're going to send everyone this. I'm going to ask John to please share, and we have already got some questions from the audience, so we're starting there. For the guys that you're here, there is some people in here now. You can send them through the Q&A box at the bottom. For the guys in YouTube, just put them in the chat, and then we'll take them afterwards. And I've also have some of my own. So, John, go right ahead. Just take the mute of your microphone, because otherwise we cannot hear you.
There we go. Fantastic.
There you go. Go right ahead.
See my screen?
Yes, we can see it perfectly. You're ready to go.
Okay. Right. I'm probably going to make a lot of the same points that Max has just made, particularly when we talk about the off-takers. But let's come to that. So firstly, who is AFRY? AFRY, we're a global engineering consulting advisory company. Within the consulting division and across several other AFRY divisions, we like to tell people we can offer a one-stop shop. So we're working right across the value chain from high-level strategy through to feasibility and feed studies, and just starting to offer a form of EPC to clients as well. We've worked on over 250 projects, more than 30 countries, with projects with a cumulative electrolyzer capacity of more than 15 gigawatt, range from 10, 20 megawatt up to multi-gigawatt scale. So please, any questions on hydrogen, please don't hesitate to contact us. But let's move on, because it's not an advert. Okay. So the Delegated Act, and Max has done a great job of explaining where we are and some of the issues and some of the uncertainties that have been caused by the Delegated Act. What the main point I want to make is that the Delegated Acts are just one driver that are shaping the European hydrogen landscape. And as we've heard already, they provide a certain level of certainty that project developers are now using to try and ensure that the hydrogen they produce from their projects will be, at least in part, RFMBO compliant. But again, as Max has pointed out, there are other issues at play here that are affecting project developers. We do quite a lot of work on transactions, and we've advised a number of investors over the past 6 to 12 months when they look at project developers. So we've gained a really good view of project developers and the main issues that project developers are facing, and the main issues that investors look at when they consider making an investment. So the Delegated Acts are a really important part, but there are other factors that we also need to consider in what you see on this slide in no particular order, but start with the cost first. First of all, we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, the costs of projects increase rather than decrease. There was an expectation that as more projects were developed, they were developed at scale. You had learning rates for the technology that would lead to reductions in costs. Now, because of global events, we've seen inflation increase, we've seen cost of capital increase, we've seen supply chain issues, or we've seen projects not take a FID where we expected. So the manufacturers yet haven't scaled up their operations. So the cost of electrolyzers has increased. It certainly hasn't reduced as some people were expecting a few years ago. But it's not just about the electrolyzer, it's also about the balance plant, it's about transformers, it's about rectifiers. If you're producing ammonia, it's also then about Haber-Bosch loop, it's about compressors, it's about storage. The cost of everything has increased. So this means that hydrogen, or green hydrogen, RFMBO hydrogen, if we like, isn't as affordable as we would have expected a couple of years ago, when we had visions about how the hydrogen market would develop in Europe. And one thing that we always like to stress is that when you see an LCOH, a levelized cost of hydrogen, particularly if you see it in the €2 to €2.5 per kilogram being produced in Europe, we don't buy it. We think costs have been driven much higher. The levelized cost of hydrogen production is much higher than people were expecting a few years ago. Now, policy and incentives are obviously helping. We've seen clarity being delivered through the Delegated Acts, but the interpretation of those Delegated Acts raise a lot more questions, and we've already seen what a 20, 30-page FAQ document had to be published by the Commission to answer a lot of the questions that project developers and OEMs have been asking the Commission. However, those FAQs, they're helpful in some regards. In some regards, I think they create even more questions and some uncertainty. But where we are seeing progress is we're seeing incentives and support mechanisms being developed. If we look at the European Hydrogen Bank and the forthcoming auctions for the EHB, we look at mechanisms such as H2 Global. They are there and they are helping the business case of projects. But because costs are higher than we thought they were going to be, maybe the funding available in these support mechanisms isn't going as far as we would have liked, and so therefore won't support as many projects of significant scale. Interestingly, we saw the Denmark auction results being announced recently. It's interesting to see some of the projects in there, some of the projects that are being funded. And this is all positive. You know, this is a really good step in the right direction. But what a lot of these mechanisms aren't yet doing is they're not targeting specific off-takers. So they're not targeting specific sectors of industry, or they're not targeting transport. But what we are seeing for the off-take sectors is we often see the analogy between a carrot and stick, whereas in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's a carrot, that's an incentive. What we tend to see in Europe and the way we approach things is to have more of a stick. And what I mean by this is we are seeing obligations come through in RED 3 for the use of RFMBO compliant hydrogen in industrial sectors, which will be 42% by 2030, 60% by 2035. And then also some obligations for RFMBO use in transport sectors as well, transport as a whole, but also then in aviation and the maritime sector. Now, what we don't know yet is how big that stick is going to be, or how much it's going to hurt if it's ever used. So the penalties that might come if some of these obligations aren't met, we don't yet know. And those penalties are likely to put a cap on the value of RFMBO hydrogen. Aside from that, we're also still aware that there are a number of technical issues that are affecting projects. Basically, what we're doing to produce RFMBO hydrogen in compliance with the Delegated Acts is you're taking a power source that's very variable. You know, it varies within hour, across days, across the seasons, etc. So it's a very variable, weather-dependent power source that you've got, and you're using that in what basically is a chemical factory. You're producing hydrogen, you're using technology that has always been designed, particularly if you then think about e-fuel production or you think about ammonia production, it's designed to run flat. It's not designed to follow variable renewable power generation. So there are a lot of challenges around trying to make the electrolyzer, the hydrogen production part of the value chain, operate in a flexible manner. Obviously, different types of electrolyzers being developed to meet this challenge. But while the electrolyzers might be flexible, the rest of the value chain, the production process, isn't that flexible. We also yet haven't seen multiple 2, 5, 10 megawatt modules of the electrolyzers put together to create 150 megawatt, 200 megawatt, gigawatt scale production. So there's still a lot of learning that needs to take place in order for there to be a lot of confidence in the technology, and in order for the OEMs to give performance guarantees. And these performance guarantees are critical when it comes to the bankability of a project. An investor wants to know that the technology is going to work and it's going to be reliable and it's going to produce the amount of hydrogen that the business case says it will. Fourthly, the offtake part, and you know this should probably right up front and center when we think about hydrogen. Currently, off-takers, or phrase it another way, there's a big gap between the off-taker willingness to pay and the cost of supplying RFMBO compliant hydrogen. If you think about the other things I've just mentioned, about some of the technical challenges, about the lack of incentives on the off-taker side, but also the increasing costs. This means that the cost of delivering RFMBO to compliant hydrogen to the off-taker, not just producing it, but delivering it, leads to even higher costs. So, you know, our estimate, and it's very location specific and project specific, that if you're trying to deliver RFMBO compliant hydrogen to an off-taker, if it's co-located, the electrolyzer is co-located, so you haven't even got distribution and transmission. As soon as you take the variable power production, the variable hydrogen production, you need to buffer it with storage in order to deliver a flat profile for hydrogen into an offtake. You're much higher than 2-3 euro per kilogram, and you're more in the region 8 euro per kilogram, or maybe even higher, and even higher if you need to transport it. which brings me to my last point, which is about the infrastructure. And the infrastructure isn't yet there to allow that transmission, distribution, and at-scale storage of hydrogen. So we're seeing incentives, or well, not really incentives, but plans come into place about the European hydrogen backbone, but still very localized, taking first steps. We see plans to convert gas storage into hydrogen storage, but again, there isn't yet any available. So it's very difficult when an investor is looking at a project development pipeline to have a lot of confidence that, firstly, the cost of the hydrogen production, the reliability of the technology, the delivery of that hydrogen to the end user, and then, as Max said, critical that you find an offtake that's willing to pay, that will give you a return on your investment, is willing to sign a long-term contract, and is willing to commit to volumes. And, just having a term sheet or an LOI isn't concrete enough. From the off-taker's perspective, one of the questions we get asked quite a lot is, why should we do it now? Why don't we wait 5 years? In 5 years' time, the technology will be better. It'll be more efficient. It'll be proven. We think costs might have started reducing by then. Some of the infrastructure will be in place. So why should we commit now? Why don't we wait 5 years? And it's very difficult to come up with an answer to that, to convince someone to sign a 15-year offtake contract, probably at a fixed price. Why sign that now and not wait a few years? So to conclude, I'm sounding a bit pessimistic about the whole development. We're still on the first rung of the ladder. There are lots more rungs we have to get up. And what the policymakers need to be doing is to make that progress up that ladder as easy as possible. Let's not put in rules that are really difficult to understand, that require a 30-page FAQ document to try and explain what's in the policy documents. We're also working, like Max, for exporters to Europe, and we're faced with the same problems. What is the bidding zone? We don't have the same concept of a bidding zone in country X. How do we make sure, before we take FID, before we know what that certification process and who the body is going to be, how do we invest? We're taking a massive risk that we'll invest in this project and we won't be certified as producing RFNBO compliant hydrogen. So there are some real practical issues that are facing project developers and investors. And the job of the policymakers is to make this as easy as possible, obviously while still respecting the principles of the Delegated Acts around additionality and not causing issues to the networks through the temporal correlation, etc. But, let's make this a bit easier for people to have some certainty so they can go ahead and make those investments.
Thank you very much, John. There is so much that you've both gone through in your presentation. There are so many things I think that we need to clarify and speak about. Can you just stop sharing so that we can see and we can go to the questions, if you don't mind? I'd like to see you. Perfect. Okay, let's get into this a little bit. We have a few questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask a couple of things first. Okay, so the non-EU projects, this seems to be an issue that you both have raised. There is a lot of uncertainty. So what are the main areas of uncertainty and what do we need to overcome them? And we're going to try to be as sort of short as possible. Max, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think the whole, everything which relates around grid stability, so in particular the bidding zone concepts, and also some form of geographic correlation. This is something which is not relevant for, or in many cases not relevant, or relevant in a different case for non-EU projects. So the single one which concerns me most is geographic correlation.
Which is a very complicated to understand and to enforce rule, I think. So, John, what about you? Do you want to add?
I would agree. I think if you're developing a project in a third country outside the EU, that is, the configuration is relatively simple. So if you have a renewable or a solar project that you're developing alongside a hydrogen project, and you've got a direct connection from your renewables into the electrolyzer and the hydrogen production, I think then that's pretty clear. But if you do that, you're then limiting the number of hours your electrolyzer can operate. So all the complications come around then when you want to connect your electrolyzer to the grid, either to supplement the power you're getting through a direct connection, or to be supplied through a PPA, or even possibly using the electrolyzer in some other hours where use of grid power could meet the 70% greenhouse gas emission reduction target as well. So that is where all the complications come, and that's when you have to start worrying about the bidding zone, how you demonstrate the temporal correlation, etc. So it's as soon as you connect to a grid, it gets complicated.
I have to say, guys, if the PNIECs, the national plans going, like we actually managed to get there, like by 2030, supposedly in many countries or most countries, it won't be a massive problem. We'll have decarbonized so much the grid to a very large extent. The issue is that it just seems there's a lot of really ambitious plans, like stacked on top of one another, that, it's like a little bit of the house of cards, effect, like looking at it from outside. So it's a little bit on the scary side. Just one more question wanted to ask from the ones who had prepared, because we have so many that I want to get through them, and they're kind of related as well. But the one that I wanted to ask is, how can the operating hours of an electrolyzer be increased whilst still producing compliant hydrogen? This is how did you get to that point? How did you do it, John? And obviously, Max, if you want to add.
Yeah, so one of the questions we get asked when we're talking to project developers is, they're clear on either the direct connections I just mentioned, or the temporal matching, be it monthly or hourly, through a renewable PPA. But then the question is, in the hours where my renewables aren't generating either directly or through the PPA, can we use the electrolyzer? Can we operate it with grid power when our renewables aren't generating? And the reason why that is so attractive is you just invested millions in an asset, which in a large number of hours is just going to sit there doing nothing. So you want to be using that electrolyzer as much as you can in order to make a decent recovery against your investment. So the delegated acts, or the questions, do clarify to some extent that you can operate your electrolyzer through a combination of your renewable power that you've contracted for and taking some grid power. However, what you also then need to be in mind of is that if the overall production of hydrogen and the emissions associated with the overall production of hydrogen within your entire project, so using your renewables alongside grid power, if in totality your hydrogen doesn't meet the 70% greenhouse gas emissions target, then none of it's RFMBO. So you can use grid power in addition to your renewables, as long as you're still hitting that 70% greenhouse gas emission reduction target. And that is where there's a big uncertainty, because how do you know in a particular hour ahead of time when you switch your electrolyzer on exactly what the carbon intensity of the grid is at that time and what the marginal source of power is in that grid? So you might be guided by a price signal. So when prices are high, probably there's not a lot of renewables generating on the system, and you'll know that because your direct connection or your PPA renewables won't be generating. So you can be guided somewhat by the price signal, but it is a little bit of a gamble that you're taking, because you're still going to meet that 70% GHG emission reduction. And a lot of the information you probably won't know until after the end of the hour. Monthly it's a lot easier, but on an hourly basis, it's probably a bit more difficult to manage.
I was going to ask you, there was a question here about the impact of moving from monthly to hourly temporal correlation. And I think that's really interesting to understand. Can you explain?
Well, our analysis would say it's going to increase RFMBO compliant hydrogen by about 25%. If you had a monthly correlation, you wouldn't need to include or incorporate so much storage. You could operate your electrolyzer on a flatter basis. You would size your renewables and your electrolyzer capacity in order to optimize to a monthly correlation. So the first thing to say is monthly correlation will be much cheaper than hourly correlation. However, because we know that hourly correlation is going to start from the 1st January 2030, if you're developing a project today, you're not going to design it for monthly correlation. You're going to design it for hourly correlation because you know that's coming. You've got a 20-25 year lifetime of your asset. You can't design it for the next 3 to 4 years by the time you're operational from today. So you might be able to phase the investment, introduce storage at a later date, increase your renewable capacity at a later date, but the impact is going to be an increase in costs.
Yeah, and one more point to add on that. We are asked quite regularly, do you think that the hourly correlation will go away so that we can have monthly correlation for the time being? And the answer to that is no, I don't think so. And the point here is you have to understand that the hourly correlation is something which is needed from a grid stability perspective. And this was a huge point of discussion. And I think with the ever-increasing buildup of volatile power producers, i.e. wind and solar, the pressure on grids will get higher and not lower. So anything which is in favor of grid stability, which hourly correlation at the end of the day is, will certainly be with us.
That was really clear, and there is a good reason for it. However, there is a lot of questions from the audience about whether things in the delegated acts will continue, and they will be. So let me read some of them. For example, someone here from YouTube asked, what is the possibility that requirements for RED 3 will change in the future? What process would be required? In political risk, backlash of voters? And I mean, to be honest, these days it seems like everything is changing in the EU. The combustion engines, for example, reductions, they're going to be scrapped. A lot of things are being scrapped, as time. So I think there is like room for reliving, that things could change. So what is your opinion on this?
Well, I try to start an answer. The point here is the delegated acts were drafted already with a view to RED 3. So I don't think that the delegated acts we now have will be amended in some major form in the foreseeable future. I'm quite sure they will more or less stay the way they are, regardless of RED 3, regardless of the changes we see elsewhere. Quite to the contrary, RED 3, in my view, just provides more areas of applicability for the delegated acts. So the delegated acts will be relevant for even more sectors, and not only the transport sector, which is the one we're looking at currently when we're looking at the delegated acts. But and the question is, do you think there will be additional requirements or additional regulatory initiatives? Maybe that depends a bit on the development, but the fact that we discussed around the delegated acts for such a long time, and experts were involved on all levels and all points were really discussed to quite an extensive level. I don't think the EU will just throw them aside in, 2 years' time and say, well, that was that, and now we try something completely different.
Okay, that's good. I'll keep going. Okay, we have so many. So this is from Zoom. Do the delegated acts include references to hydrogen infrastructure operation? You just mentioned, that it will slowly be applicable to different industries. So transport and storage have to be regulated, but it's not clear if there will be specific legal developments for them.
So the delegated acts say nothing about the transport of hydrogen. It's not related to grid regulation in whatever kind and form, other than if we would at some point say, well, you can only transport green hydrogen through grids or something, then they would define what green hydrogen is. Regulation of hydrogen grid is currently thought of by the EU in other terms, and drafts have been presented. But this has a lot to do with gas regulation. This is basically whether or not gas grids can be used for the transport of hydrogen, and if so, what regulation should apply to them. But this has nothing to do with the delegated acts. This is gas grid regulation, hydrogen grid regulation. Has a lot to do with the gas markets within the EU. This is not interlinked, at least not if you're not going really, really deep down.
Thank you very much. Okay, continue. Question here about project finance bankability. It says that the Green Hydrogen Bank only supports 10 years of contract for difference, CFDs. France is considering 15 years in duration. Is there a discussion to prolong the offtake support? It says exactly the tenor of the offtake support, but do we think this is possible?
Well, that will be up to, if that is being developed by national governments, that is a national government decision. I think the issue around the timing of the CFDs is really important, though. If you say, I don't know, the lifetime of the hydrogen production asset, say it's 25 years. If you're developing one today, you're developing that, you've got an idea of the costs over the lifetime of the asset, you know what you can produce your hydrogen for, you know what you can sell it for and make return, etc. If your support mechanism through a CFD is only supporting you for 10 years of that, or 15 years, maybe if you're more optimistic, you still then got 5-10 years where you're operating without support. So you will then be selling your hydrogen, hopefully to another end user for the remainder of the asset's lifetime, or selling it into a hydrogen market if we've developed one. The issue is that you've got that merchant risk in the later years of your project. And then you will be competing against projects that have been developed further down the line. So they might have been able to take advantage of advances in electrolyzer technology, reduction in costs of electrolyzers and balance of plant, etc. And they also might be developed at a larger scale. So it's likely by the time you get to the end of your support mechanism, say that's 10 years, you're going to be in a market where other hydrogen producers are likely going to be able to supply hydrogen at a cheaper rate than you. So you need to have some way of accounting for that merchant risk when you drop out of the support mechanism. So the longer the support mechanism, the better for the bankability of the project, but that is going to be country specific.
And 10 years isn't a lot in this kind of projects. We know that even from renewables, you know. I mean, 10 years PPA, it's what's going this day for solar, but it's not excellent, really. Okay, one very specific question here. Please explain how in practical terms the rule set in Article 6 is implemented for temporal correlation when the price of electricity is below 20 euros megawatt hour.
Great question.
You're laughing there. Go on.
And I've struggled with this. When I first read the Delegated Act, you know, my initial reaction when I saw that 20 euros a megawatt hour, fantastic. When the price is below 20 euros a megawatt hour, take all your power from the grid, do what you like. Loads of renewables generating, prices dropped. But that interpretation completely wrong. So what it actually does, that 20 euro per megawatt hour, it relieves you from having to demonstrate the temporal correlation within that hour. Now, what I've been struggling with is what advantage does that give you? You know, well, your project's been set up, you've got your renewable PPAs, you know, presumably you'll have to have some period. If you're relieved from demonstrating temporal correlation within that hour, you still need to have a renewable PPA. So the generation coming from that renewable PPA will have to be accounted for somehow. But when? I don't know. Over what time period? I don't know. So I'm not sure. I don't know, Max, if you've got a view, and this would be great if someone could help me out on this as to what upside this gives you.
Not really. And we have looked into this and are currently looking into this for some clients, and might have an answer, but this is certainly something which is more for an detailed discussion on a concrete contract or live contract, as to provide an answer for for broader audience.
But
I don't know.
It's a great question.
Isn't that hinting at like maybe nuclear in times in which it's not used, a little bit like the IRA? You know, like when I saw this question, I was wondering, because in the US they have the situation where a lot of nuclear power, that is like absolutely baseload, is not used. This hasn't been thrown out. So hence, it makes sense. Although in there they have this low carbon, hence you don't have to bring it from renewable. So that's not an issue at the moment. But in countries that are reaching nuclear, like France, maybe it does make a difference. I don't know. I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I don't know.
20 euro per megawatt hour relates to the day ahead price in the market. So, on some days, I guess the price is going to be low, 20 euros per megawatt hour, when you've got lots of renewables. But if you have lots of renewables generating, aside from nuclear from home, lots of renewables generating, if you've configured your project correctly and sized your electrolyzer capacity optimally related to your renewable generator, your electrolyzer is probably going to be running flat out anyway. So you're not going to need to take any more power from the market. And because you're already set up for hourly correlation, I don't see in that instance what benefit this would give. I guess if demand is very low, you've got nuclear at base load, potentially, you've got some cheap prices in the market. But again, you've still got to have your renewable PPA to produce your RFNBO compliant hydrogen. It doesn't relieve you from that obligation. It just relieves you from having to demonstrate the temporal correlation.
All right. So it's maybe one of these things that it was done with the right heart, but then it doesn't really translate.
There might be a real benefit here and I'm just missing it.
All right. Let's put it out to the audience. If you guys can think of anything, put it in the chat.
Yeah, without saying, that if the price is below that 20 euros a megawatt hour, you don't have to demonstrate hourly matching. You can demonstrate monthly matching. But then if it's only within an hour, I just don't understand how practically it's going to work and what benefits it gives you. So if anyone out there knows, please let me know.
Yeah, I mean, please, like, you guys just put something in there, because some people here are really, really obviously work on this and have very specific questions. Okay, just 2 questions, to end, guys. One is very easy, I think, but I just wanted to check, because you never know, because with anything, what's happening right now with combustion engine, no, I think no one expected at this stage, but here we are. So, says, is there any prospects for the EU regulatory landscape to support blue hydrogen at all, or is it definitely being ruled out?
No, it's not definitely being ruled out. The EU has stated in its hydrogen strategy that it will consider blue hydrogen as a for a transitional period, and even Germany, who had a much stricter view on blue hydrogen in its first draft of the hydrogen strategy, which was issued, abandoned this part and saying, well, we need blue hydrogen for a certain period of time. Now, that being said, I don't know and have not heard of any large regulatory initiatives to provide a support scheme for blue hydrogen. The idea is, frankly, that via the stick and not the carrot regulation, the demand for hydrogen will be so high that for carbon-free hydrogen, that probably the EU thinks there will be a market for it anyway. And frankly, this is not only what the EU thinks, this is the market anticipation of lots of the MENA countries. That they say, well, we have the technique, we know everything there is to know about CCS, and we have all the facilities available to get this blue hydrogen to Europe or whoever wants to buy it. My take on this, but this is nothing less than an educated guess, is I wouldn't expect a major support scheme for blue hydrogen, but rather the expectation that that projects will see the day of light for blue hydrogen because it's just economically viable to do such projects.
Thank you very much. I don't know, John, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and then, coming from the UK, I know it's not part of Europe now, which is still a major issue for me. But we do have support for blue hydrogen in the UK. But just picking up on that point about MENA countries and the production of blue hydrogen, they'll just send it to Asia. It'll go to Japan, go to South Korea, maybe Singapore. None of whom have the same complex regulations as Europe has for the importation of low carbon hydrogen. So that is one of the issues, is that Europe might miss out on the opportunity to use low carbon hydrogen because it's not supported in Europe, and it will find another market to go to.
No, absolutely, and that's really interesting. If you are in the MENA region, they will tell you, well, it's the distance is the same. We just go wherever the price is best.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think a final question that it was one of the first one that we received actually, but I thought it was good to close off. And I am very aware that we're like 2 minutes into our time, but this is the last question. It's about how realistic really the objectives that we have, the 10 million tons by 2030, producing and another 10 importing. How realistic is this? Honestly, when I see this, I don't really know how we're going to build all of these electrolyzers. I don't really know how we're going to build all these electrolyzers without them coming from China. Already, if you leave Europe and start talking to producers everywhere else, everyone says that they're buying 100% Chinese because it's coming like at least a third cheaper, if not more. So I'm just not sure about this, and also about how it will keep this European, pioneering technology, ideal that we're kind of holding with hydrogen. So what's your thinking?
First of all, answer firstly on the, what I think is the feasibility of the 10 million ton domestic production, 10 million ton import by 2030, bearing in mind that we're coming to the close of 2023. I would say, if I'm being optimistic, I'll say it will be extremely challenging.
I'd agree with that.
Did you guys wanna even with the stick? The questioner also mentioned, that the companies are supposed to have like a 42.5 green hydrogen requirement.
So I've seen some calculations about the targets for RFNBO compliant hydrogen that would result from RED 3, and by 2030 it comes to about, I think it was about 4 million tons, maybe 4.5 million tons of hydrogen demand could be generated through that
with the stick, right? Because
but then we don't know what what's the consequences for not meeting that 42%. And there are already some ways in which you can reduce that 42% to 20% if you're meeting your country targets towards RED 3 as well. So it might be a lot less than that in those markets that are making good progress towards meeting the renewable targets, which might be the ones that could have cheaper hydrogen production because they've got more renewables.
It's a little bit like a catch-22, isn't it? All of these things, when you're building infrastructure from scratch, when you're building an industry from scratch, it's always really tough work. I mean, policy must be first and foremost because it decreases uncertainty, but at the same time, when a market is not there, what are you regulating? You're trying to create the market rather than regulate it. And when you don't have a demand for things, it's certainly complicated. We're seeing it even in other things like EVs, even in other things like heat pumps. It's just so hard to initiate that. So thank you very much, guys. I'm glad that we had this discussion. I still feel like we're going to be talking about these delegated acts for ages and trying to clarify how they affect the projects and how they affect both how we can import hydrogen and how we can produce it over here. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Max, and thank you very much that is in the room and also on YouTube. We're sorry about the issues at the very beginning, but hopefully you had a really interesting session. I think it has certainly been, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.